To set the stage for the tour, some dates and events were highlighted. They were able to see firsthand many of the most significant sites of the civil rights movement from 1955 to 1965, when President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
(1954) Brown versus the Board of Education. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. The ruling gave hope to many black people, but in the following years caused white flight to the suburbs to avoid integrating schools. Even today, city schools and rural schools suffer from underfunding.
Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American boy from Chicago who came to visit relatives in Alabama. He supposedly, this was later questioned whether it really happened, wolf whistled at the store clerk of a white store owner and was taken from his bed in the middle of the night and murdered in an incredibly brutal manner with a weight of a metal fan tied around his neck, and he was sunk in a river close by. The two perpetrators went to trial in a sham trial. We visited the courthouse and heard the story. They were allowed the perpetrators were allowed all sorts of discretion during the trial. And when the jury went out, which was, of course, only white men, they deliberated for 45 minutes and found the murderers innocent.
December 1955. Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat on a city bus to a white person. She was arrested, jailed, and in response, the black community launched a bus boycott.
In 1955 to 1956, the Montgomery bus boycott lasted more than a year, affecting commerce in the city and drawing nationwide attention to the civil rights movement. During this time, Dr. Martin Luther King was brought into the spotlight as the leader of the movement.
Freedom Riders boarded a Greyhound bus in Washington, D.C. Their intent was to test the 1960 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Boynton versus Virginia that all interstate buses, bus stations, and restrooms should be desegregated. At the Anniston, Alabama Greyhound bus station, a mob of 100 men, Ku Klux Klan members, who were dressed up as if they had come from church, trashed the bus with tire irons, broke the windows, slashed the tires, and blocked the exit. The police arrived intentionally late and finally created a pathway for the bus to escape. 2 miles out of town, the bus tires went flat. 50 cars with members of the Ku Klux Klan that had followed the bus attacked them, threw some bombs in the bus, and held the door shut. After an explosion, the riders were allowed off the bus but were beaten by the mob as the bus was burned. A bomb at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham is planted outside a church basement window. It explodes and kills 4 young girls and injures several others before Sunday services. Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman were killed after being at a church that had been burned. Police stopped them and brutally killed them. Schwerner and Goodman were white young men from New York. Chaney was from Meriden, Mississippi. The bodies were not found until 41 days later, when an informant led authorities to an earthen dam where they had been buried. On March 7th, 1965, around 600 civil rights marchers expect to walk from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama's state capital, to protest Black voter suppression. Local police block and brutally attack them on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. After successfully fighting in court for their right to march, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, including John Lewis, who later became a congressman, led 2 more marches and finally reached Montgomery on March 25th.
Viewers may ask, why did they go on this trip? In the words of individuals from the group, here is what they expressed.
In early 2019, I had a good friend of mine, Harry Forrest, who said, Jerry, we were just on a trip, a civil rights trip in Alabama, Mississippi. That's the best thing that we've ever experienced in any travels we ever had in life. Well, I tucked that information in my head. And then a few months later, I thought, yeah, I remember what Harry said. So I contacted the Swiggums, and lo and behold, we were able to organize a trip in November 2019. During that short 7-day trip, I became more aware of and sympathetic of what it was like to be a Black person in the United States of America. As I met these people, I became aware that these people landed in the United States, not by choice, but being forced to be slaves, to work on plantations, to work beside the whip of somebody else overtaking their life. The stories we heard as we met the foot soldiers who were the Black Americans told us about their struggle to have freedom, their ability to vote, and being thwarted in every effort that they took. And at that time, I thought, I need to be an advocate for these people. Call for them to have equal justice, good health insurance, being able to have vote and be able to get good jobs, and have equal and fair treatment by police departments and the courts. And yes, I'd like to become friends. I more fully realized that I'm a white kid that grew up on a farm in Iowa. And I had not a clue what it was like to be white as compared to what it was like to be Black. I never thought about how my skin color was advantage in anything I did in my life, whether I went to buy something, whether I met people on the street, or I went to school. This trip brought me to a greater awareness of the challenges it is to be a Black person. Medically, educationally, and financially, I have received a great big advantage. To use a baseball metaphor, I was born on third base. And if I had been Black, I would be struggling to get to first base. I was impressed with the foot soldiers we met. During the civil rights movement, many of them were children in school, and they skipped school to go out and march. They went out and marched because if their parents had gone out and marched, they would have been jailed and not able to go to work. But the kids did that, even in spite of what their parents wanted them to do. They too were jailed. They were tortured. They were mocked. They were made humiliated. But now, as I met them, here are some very articulate, passionate, and joyful human beings. They're captivating stories filled with great insight. After they experienced hell, they spoke without bitterness or pity or spite. They did not guilt us. Truly, their scars have become stars.
I learned about racism when, as a 1959 graduate of the College of St. Benedict, I volunteered to teach for a year in the Bahama Islands. A classmate of mine also volunteered. When we arrived, we joined 2 other teachers and 2 nurses who were all volunteers. 85% of the population of the Bahamas is of African descent. Bahamians received us graciously and warmly, and we came to care for them deeply. We were horrified by their stories of the prejudice they experienced by simply flying to Miami, a 25-minute flight away, to do some shopping. No eating in a restaurant. Buy your food and eat it on the sidewalk outside. And don't even think about trying to stay overnight. After returning to Minnesota, some of the friendships made were maintained, but eventually we drifted apart. However, I did follow closely the civil rights activities in the United States and was encouraged by the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Conversely, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King was a blow to any optimism. The election of a U.S. president of African descent did provide a glimmer of hope once again in 2008. In November of 2019, I became aware that the Swiggums were offering a civil rights tour to members of Nativity Lutheran Church. The Swiggums, retired teachers, had conducted approximately 20 tours of this type and have made this an avocation of theirs in retirement. They provided lots of resources such as readings, videos, films, etc., in advance of the trip to help us prepare for the tour.
A comment I made after returning from our civil rights tour was, what I did not know about the civil rights movement was everything. What surprised me the most was that it was and is a Christian movement. I'd like to expound on those two statements a bit. First, I did know some things about the civil rights movement, obviously, but nearly everything I learned on our trip was new information with new insights, so I really did feel that I had known nothing. How could that be? Well, I was 2 years old when Emmett Till was murdered and Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white bus passenger. I was 8 when the Freedom Riders boarded buses and headed south. I wasn't quite 12 on Bloody Sunday in Selma. I was 14 when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. But I'm not using my age as an excuse for my ignorance, because the real reason for it was my own lack of curiosity. But nothing had sparked that curiosity. I grew up in north central South Dakota. First time I saw a Black person may have been on a family trip to Minneapolis. We never talked about racism because we only saw one race. I learned absolutely nothing about the civil rights movement in any class from K through 12, and I didn't learn much more about it while pursuing my college degree. What I did become aware of during my youth was the ugly racism toward the indigenous peoples of South Dakota. But that was easily ignored living far from any reservation. Finally, in my 60s, and thanks to the Swiggums and Jerry Hoffman and my wife, Lisa, I got curious and I headed south to learn. As for learning that the civil rights movement was a Christian movement, we visited nearly 12 churches during our 1-week trip. And this wasn't because that was convenient. It was because they were all significant historical sites from the civil rights movement. These churches were known for being the birthplace or the headquarters of the movement or of certain organizations. They were gathering places for planning and executing protests and marches. They were first aid stations for those who were wounded during marches. They were polling places for Black voters. They were places where Black youth were trained to be nonviolent protesters. Some churches hosted freedom schools. This all made perfect sense to me when I realized that Black churches were the only places where Blacks were in charge at that time. They suffered the horrors and indignities of racism on a daily basis, but at their churches, they were in charge. So These churches naturally became centers for organizing and recruiting and planning what became the civil rights movement. Because of this, these churches were threatened and burned and bombed. And some of the people we met were scarred and still suffering from PTSD. The people we met with in these churches during our trip were often some of the actual foot soldiers in the early days of the civil rights movement. We were in their churches where they were still active and learned that they were still fighting for freedom. Before the trip, I had imagined feeling awkward or like unwanted tourists. Here we were, a group of older white people from Minnesota come to see these historic sites. But these amazing people welcomed us with smiles and hugs and appreciation and love. Now, I credit the Swiggums, our tour guides, with finding these heroes and becoming close friends with them. But what we saw and who we met was who these people are. We came to understand not only their civil rights movement stories and their roles in today's civil rights movement, but we got to see their Christian faith as strong as and intertwined with their commitments to justice. It was humbling and overwhelming.